as an early proponent of democratic government, as someone who was very pro-democracy. And so scholars like I, right, long focused their attention on the Persian Otanes. Okay, so let's make sure this is, let me go into my PowerPoint here. On the Persian Otanes, praise for Athens' embrace of isonomia in the so-called constitutional debate. I've got lots of passages. I will not have time to go over them in great detail, but anybody who wants to go over anything with me, please let me know. Now, Otanes here suggests that rule by lot, deliberation, accountability, and the political equality they produce can restrain self-interested individuals from gaining excessive power. Today, however, I will argue that the histories undermines Otanes' praise of popular rule through negative depictions of collective decision-making broadly understood, i.e. whenever large groups in the text, and here I'm including both Greek and non-Greek groups, enjoy the opportunity to deliberate and or vote. Now, in the second half of my paper, I shall argue that Herodotus likewise raises questions about popular rule in his accounts of both Athenian political development and the Athenian democracy at work. As I hope to demonstrate, and again, I'm moving my cursor back and forth here. As I hope to demonstrate today, Herodotus's treatments of popular deliberation and suffrage ultimately validate the other two Persian conspirators' critiques of the people. So namely here, Megabyzus' critique, which we can come back to, and the critique of, okay, I gotta go back in here, I'm sorry, oops. Okay, and the critique of Darius. Herodotus's accounts of group decision-making and suffrage, in fact, I'm going to argue today, provide a surprisingly consistent portrayal of the people as passive, fickle, and easily manipulated by the kind of persuasive language that Darius himself lauds at 372-4-5. In every case I will consider today, the people end up at the mercy of clever and ambitious individuals like Darius, whose self-interest initially drives the conspirators to bypass deliberation in their haste to kill the Magus, and finally wins him the Persian throne through deceit. Okay, so throughout the histories, Herodotus provides examples of polities in which large groups of citizens, and even at times the entire citizenry, engage in collective decision-making. Although post-Cleisthenes Athens is the only actual democracy featured at length in the histories, all of these examples of group political activity provide Herodotus's readers with the opportunity to assess the validity of the models of political behavior that the Persian conspirators put forward in the constitutional debate. Okay, so Herodotus's account of the Median Deioces is, I think, a great place to begin, with its counterintuitive depiction of the Medes' seemingly democratic exercise of power, only to cede their recently won freedom by choosing to be ruled by a king. Communality marks the entire decision-making process, from the Medes' initial gathering in one spot, to their public deliberations, and finally, to their consensual vote for Deioces. Speech also occupies a key place in the proceedings, as Herodotus emphasizes in his repeated use of logos-related terms and his reference to the role that persuasion plays in the final decision. Now, while the Medes ostensibly made a good faith effort to engage in open deliberation, Herodotus's framing of the Deioces episode, excuse me, let me go back here, of the Deioces episode, okay, you'll excuse me, suggests that the process was doomed from its inception. Herodotus opens his account of the Medes, what I'm going to call here in scare quotes, democratic experiment, by foreshadowing its failure thanks to Deioces, a man he describes as clever, notable, and most importantly, infatuated with tyranny. Deioces' courting of power, according to Herodotus, underpinned both his exemplary dispensation of justice and later his abrupt refusal to hear cases. In addition to orchestrating the chaos that induced the Medes to assemble, Deioces apparently manipulated the General Assembly through his strategic deployment of friends. That's at 197.2. These friends, according to Herodotus, both helped to persuade their fellow Medes to vote for a return to autocracy, and later secured Deioces' appointment through their vociferous promotion and praise of him. And thus concludes Herodotus' account of the Medes' brief flirtation with freedom. By framing the Deioces logos with references to Deioces' unfettered ambition and later exploitation of clever speech, Herodotus suggests that popular rule cannot prove transformative of human nature in the way that Otanes postulates in the speech that Herodotus attributes to him in his account of the constitutional debate, at least not among the Medes. Rather, we see in Deioces a powerful testament to the triumph of self-interest, both recognized and realized by Darius in his, again, account during the constitutional debate. Deioces' rise to power at the same time highlights weaknesses in Otanes' model of the effective Plathos at work. The Medes proved to be essentially lawless and incapable of governing themselves, a state of affairs that both necessitated the reimposition of one-man rule and left the people prey to the clever Deioces. Herodotus also emphasizes the Medes' passivity as Deioces set the agenda through his own bid for power, and his comrades manipulated the assembly through persuasive speech, itself a dangerous yet central element of popular decision-making. Herodotus provides an equally striking description of collective decision-making in his account of Cyrus the Great's initial rise to power. According to Herodotus, the Persian noble Harpagus exacted revenge upon Astyages by paying court to his grandson Cyrus and convincing him to persuade the Persian people to revolt from Median rule. Cyrus thereupon summoned an assembly, falsely claimed that Astyages had appointed him commander of the Persian army, and easily persuaded the Persians to obey his subsequent orders. First, to assemble with sickles and to clear a large plot of rough land, and second, to assemble again, and this time to enjoy a sumptuous banquet. According to Herodotus, Cyrus then exploited the Persians' obvious preference for leisure by promising them, and if you'll excuse me, I think I skipped, oh goodness, I'm on the wrong, hold on. There we go with Cyrus. By promising them continued pleasure if they made him their leader. The parallels between this account and Herodotus' earlier discussion of the Medes' journey from autonomy to autocracy are obvious. Here we meet another ambitious man who manipulates and persuades an assembly of citizens under the guise of collective deliberation to surrender their freedom. And once again, we see the impossibility of true open debate as Cyrus poses the assembled Persians a question: pleasure or pain, which demands an obvious answer rather than thoughtful discussion. The Persians in this account provide an even bleaker picture of what I'm going to call popular government than the Medes, whom Herodotus portrays at least as initially capable of self-determination and self-rule in both their acquisition of freedom from Assyrian control and their public deliberations. Herodotus's Persians instead are incapable of thinking and acting for themselves, and they only assemble upon Cyrus's orders. As a decision-making body, they prove at once unthinking and rash, from their initial failure to question Cyrus's credentials to their consent to revolt from the Medes. Most striking, however, is the Persians' passivity throughout their encounter with Cyrus, as they first allow themselves to be persuaded by Cyrus and later obey his every command as they revolt from one master to another. Herodotus emphasizes both the central role of persuasive speech and the Persians' rapid transition from persuasion to obedience in his repeated use of pathomai and related terms in his account of their interaction with Cyrus. In his characterization of Cyrus, Herodotus validates the utility of speech for the aspiring autocrat that Darius later builds on in his defense of lies before we get to the constitutional debate. Now, perhaps even more troubling is the nature of the freedom that is ostensibly within the Persians' grasp. Unlike the freedom that Medes won for themselves, liberty here is a gift bestowed by Cyrus on condition of the Persians' obedience. This oxymoronic marriage of obedience and freedom deprives the latter of all meaning. The promise of freedom is now nothing more than a tool that Cyrus employs to gain power. Indeed, while Cyrus offers the Persians freedom from external control, he simultaneously deprives them of internal autonomy. The future Darius makes a similar and even more hollow appeal to freedom in his later defense of monarchy in the constitutional debate. After describing how all political systems inevitably lead to the ascent of one leader who gains absolute power, Darius recalls Cyrus the Great's rise, quote, "Where did our freedom come from and who gave it to us? Did it come from the people or an oligarchy or a monarch? I believe that since we were freed by one man, we should keep doing things this way." Now, while Darius, like Cyrus, seems to define eleutheria as national autonomy rather than freedom within the state, Darius uses this argument about freedom in the context of an internal struggle for power within Persia, as Sidnor Roy has pointed out. Darius's consequently specious claim that monarchy guarantees freedom proves to be yet another example of the clever speech that the ambitious man exploits to achieve his ends. Now, at this point, any of you might argue that Herodotus, through his treatments of the Medes and Persians, similar reversions to autocracy, portrays barbarians as simply incapable of embracing political change in the form of a transition from autocracy to constitutional structures based on power sharing and the rule of law, as Don Latiner has argued. Now, even if one takes a less jaundiced view of Herodotean bias, it still has to be admitted that neither of these examples of collective decision-making, which again take place among non-democratic and non-Greek groups, can adequately illuminate Herodotus's view of popular rule in general and of Athenian democratic practice in particular. Any investigation of Herodotus's stance on democracy necessitates a close reading of his descriptions of collective political action in Athens during and after the late 6th century Cleisthenes reforms. So I'm now going to turn to Herodotus's accounts of Athenian democracy to consider whether or not they support Otanes' description of popular rule as a system of government that restrains human vice and promotes equality by holding its officials accountable and making decisions through debate. Now, an obvious starting point for this exploration in the history's account of the political ascendance the obvious point is his account of the political ascendance of Cleisthenes, the leader who, according to Herodotus, quote, established for the Athenians both their tribes and their democracy at 131.1. Now, while Cleisthenes may be the man responsible for Athens' transition from tyranny to democracy, Herodotus' structuring of the Cleisthenes Logos, which runs from 566 to 573, provides what I'm going to argue today is a rather unflattering portrait of the Alcmaeonid leader and the demos that he ostensibly empowered. In his introduction to Cleisthenes, Herodotus focuses on the Athenians' involvement in factional strife, his tyrannical lineage, and his reputed bribery of the Pythia, as you can see here. Far more striking, however, is Herodotus's claim at 566.2 that Cleisthenes, after his initial defeat at the hands of Isagoras, took on the Demos as his political ally. In his later description of Cleisthenes' tribal, excuse me, sorry, I think I went too far there. Okay, yes. In his later description of Cleisthenes' tribal reorganization, Herodotus again highlights the Alcmaeonids' use of the Athenian demos to triumph over his opponents. In his focus on Cleisthenes' struggle with his aristocratic competitors, Herodotus, again, sorry, guys, I'm sorry, I'm like toggling back and forth here, so forgive me. So in his, and I lost my place here. So in his later description of Cleisthenes' tribal reorganization, right, Herodotus again here is highlighting his use of the demos. In his focus on Cleisthenes' struggle with his aristocratic competitors, Herodotus recalls Darius' earlier claims about the inherent weakness of oligarchic rule and its inevitable devolution into monarchy. Now, the Athenian demos cuts an equally poor figure in this account as the political, what I would call the passive political plaything of the Alcmaeonic Cleisthenes. Like Cyrus's Persians, Cleisthenes Athenians lack true political agency and are receivers of rather than fighters for freedom. Now, it is true that the post-Cleisthenic demos later united successfully against Isagoras and Cleomenes. They defeated Athens' Chalcidian and Boeotian enemies, we're told, and thus proved, again, according to Herodotus, again, I'm going to get to my, again, toggling back and forth here, how excellent a thing equality of speech isagoria is, not in one respect only, but in all. We also cannot overlook Herodotus's ensuing claim that the Athenians, once they had flung off the yoke of tyranny, had proved the finest fighters in the world, because the freedom they were given made each Athenian eager to achieve for himself. Now, while Herodotus here offers his most explicit praise of Athens' democratic political structure, this eulogy in no way discounts his other problematic account of the birth of popular government in Athens. Athens' democracy, by Herodotus' account, would seem to have been the accidental byproduct of both stasis among competing elites and a political tactic employed by the grandson of a tyrant who was in desperate need of political support. The democracy's origin appears to have been driven wholly by self-interest, as was its increasing strength, as Herodotus himself notes in his praise of isagoria. Everyone's eager to achieve for himself. Both the democracy's founder and its later adherents thus seem to bear out the Persian Darius' earlier claims about human nature at 372, 4-5. Every man, whether a would-be Persian despot or an Athenian democrat, eagerly works to his own advantage by any means necessary. Now, in addition to its roots in factionalism, tyranny, and self-interest, Athens' young democracy further undermines Herodotus' claim concerning the excellence of isagoria through its interaction with the Milesian tyrant Aristagoras when he came to Athens after failing to persuade the Spartan Cleomenes I to support the Ionians' revolt. Okay, so appearing before the demos, Aristagoras ostensibly made a speech in which he repeated the arguments he had made earlier in Sparta. He then overwhelmed the assembled Athenians with statements aimed to flatter them and to appeal to both their imperialistic leanings and their ambition. At last, we're told, Aristagoras persuaded Anapese, the people, a success that both indicated an inherent problem with democratic rule and had serious consequences for Greeks and barbarians alike, as Herodotus makes clear. In his emphasis on the Athenian susceptibility to clever speech and his pointed comment about this poorly deliberated decision's ramifications, Herodotus clearly counters the Persian Otanes' claim about popular deliberation. More voices, in this case ostensibly 30,000 Athenians, do not provide a better political outcome. In books 6 and 7 of his histories, Herodotus suggests that the same flaws that tainted the Cleisthenic democracy, namely self-interested leaders, a passive and unthinking demos, and persuasive rhetoric, continued to bedevil the Athenian democracy under the leadership of two more elite figures, Miltiades and Themistocles. Now, when we first meet Miltiades, Herodotus informs us that this aristocrat had only recently escaped punishment for his tyranny in the Cleisthenes before the Athenian people elected him as one of their generals. Now, this passage's stark juxtaposition of Miltiades' unaccountability as a tyrant with the demos' election of him as a strategos merits attention. Herodotus here seems to bear out Megabyzus' critique of popular government as he portrays the Athenians, like the Medes and the Persians I described earlier, as thoughtlessly rushing to give power to an individual with obvious despotic inclinations. Herodotus again underlines the unhealthy relationship between the Athenian demos and its leaders when he goes on to describe how Miltiades' growing reputation after Marathon allowed him to do whatever he pleased with the demos' support. Here at 6.132, we learn that Miltiades easily deceived the Athenians into giving him ships, troops, and money, and so emotionally manipulated them with his promise of enrichment that they did not even bother to ask about the object of his expedition. Now, according to Herodotus, Miltiades' true purpose was to attack the Persians in order to avenge a personal attack on his reputation. In sharp contrast to Otanes' idealistic vision of the Plathos at work, there is no real deliberation in this instance of Athenian collective decision-making. Rather, we find the Athenian demos literally carried away by greed and rushing, like the mob earlier described by the Persian Megabyzus, right? Rushing, quote, blindly at things and batters at them like a river in winter spate. And again, that's Megabyzus at 381.2. This tableau likewise bears out Darius' claims about the power of human self-interest, humans' inclinations to lie in order to achieve their ends, and the inevitability that the people's admiration effectively turns their champions into monarchs. More importantly, throughout his account of Miltiades, from his seemingly hasty election as general to his death in much the same circumstances as the Persian king Cambyses, Herodotus confirms Darius' belief in the demos' inability to curb ambitious individuals. Even if we admit that much of this negative press on Miltiades originated with an anti-Chimonid source, such as the rival Alcmaeonids, one cannot ignore the familiar Herodotean pattern that Miltiades follows in his democratic career path, in his hasty election and later development into a veritable autocrat. And I'm going to then turn in conclusion to Themistocles. Okay, so the Athenian Themistocles career follows the same basic path in books 7 and 8, from his initial service to the demos, to his self-interested deception of the people, and then into a descent into quasi-tyrannical hubris and use of compulsion to achieve his ends. Signs of trouble clearly appear in Herodotus' account of Themistocles' leadership after the Greek success at Salamis, when Themistocles failed to persuade Eurybiades and the other Peloponnesian leaders to sail to the Hellespont and destroy the bridges there. According to Herodotus, Themistocles then suddenly and sharply shifted his ground and now urged the Athenians to let the Persian king flee, ostensibly on account of his desire to curry favor with Xerxes in case he were to suffer at the hands of the Athenians, as in fact he later did. Herodotus then adds that Themistocles purposely deceived the Athenians into shifting their own position on Xerxes' escape and achieved his ends by convincing them of his cleverness and turning them into obedient subjects. As we've seen already, this easy and speedy, and I'd say frightening transition from persuasion to obedience recurs as we've seen how it recurs in the history, right? Themistocles here notes the close relationship between the two in a passage that is, to me, incredibly striking. And this is, he notes, again, this close relationship between persuasion and obedience during his ensuing attempt to extort money from the Andrians at 8:111. Now, through Themistocles' speech, Herodotus suggests that persuasion and compulsion go hand in hand and underlines once again an inherent fracture in a political system that relies on persuasive speech and consequently empowers effective speakers. In Themistocles' abuse of power, we likewise see the dangerous trajectory from admired leader to autocrat outlined by Darius in the constitutional debate. In his account of Miltiades, in his account of Themistocles' interaction with the Andrians, just as he did with Miltiades' interactions with the Athenian demos, Herodotus here reveals the dark side of the popular rule that Otanes lauds in his debate. Collective decision-making in Athens, whether it's under Themistocles or Miltiades, turns out to be at best a facsimile of true deliberation, orchestrated by elite political actors who employ their cleverness and rhetorical skill to manipulate the unthinking and rash masses to their own advantage. Now, in such depictions of the pitfalls of collective political activity, Herodotus thus prefigures the more explicit critiques of popular rule provided by Athenian authors such as Thucydides. So years ago, I used to really think Herodotus was sort of here and Thucydides was here, but as I've been doing more work, I think they're actually closer than certainly closer than I used to think they were. He also prefigures the critiques offered by authors like the old oligarch. Herodotus, it would seem, was not merely concerned with the trajectory of Athenian imperialism, as scholars have long recognized, but was also actively engaged in the ongoing debate on the advantages and deficits of democracy in mid-5th century Athens. One can only wonder how he viewed the leading Athenian democrat of his time, Pericles, another much admired and talented leader, whose position in Athens would seem to have validated Darius' claims about the inevitability of autocracy, as J.S. Morrison argued back in 1941. And so here is, again, I'm almost at the end. Oops, sorry, let me go back. Indeed, while Thucydides claimed that Pericles rendered Athens a democracy only in name, contemporary comic poets treated him as a new Pisistratus. And particularly striking in this regard is the fragment from the comic poet Cleisthenes that depicts the Athenians docilely handing over their very power to Pericles, much in the same way that Herodotus's Athenians unquestioningly granted all of Miltiades' requests. Perhaps Herodotus too saw in Pericles' leadership, as in that of Miltiades and Themistocles before him, the inevitable devolution from democracy into autocracy. But unlike his character Darius, Herodotus would not have applauded this constitutional development and the loss of Eleutheriae, Isagoriae, and Isonomiae that autocracy inevitably entailed. Thank you.